this is social studies, and this week the unit that we're gonna be looking at is Japanese Americans at Topaz. This is a really interesting unit, a really interesting time in our country, and a lot for you to think about. This is extra long. There are a number of videos in it, and so if you listen all the way through, then you will hear what instructions I'm going to give you as we go. All right, so we're going to start off talking about World War II so that you understand a little bit of what was going on at that time. In the 1940s, a war had broken out between several countries across the world. And these countries formed two groups, then those two groups fought against each other. And one was called the Allied powers, and the other were the Axis powers. The Allied powers were Great Britain, France, and Russia, which might be a surprise to you, thinking about Russia on the same side as the U.S. at that time. And then the Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. And there were other nations that kind of jumped in as the war continued. But the U.S. really didn't want to fight in this war. But on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. And dozens of ships were destroyed and thousands of people died. So the U.S. ended up joining the war as a member of the Allied powers. And that is what was going on at the time. So what you're going to do on this slide is there are two videos there. And it gives you some questions to think about. I am going to ask that you think about those questions. There is going to be one question that I need you to answer, and that is the very last question. There's a lot of information here. So I want you to think about the questions. You don't necessarily have to type in your answer after you watch the videos. So you're going to watch the videos. You're going to think about, well, why did America join World War II? And we actually just kind of answered that. And the second question, though, is why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? And then you're going to ask how many battleships were sunk or damaged in the Pearl Harbor attacks and how many Americans were dead as a result of those attacks. So those are the things I want you to think about as you're watching those videos. There are two of them, and it is going to take you some time. So to move forward, after Pearl Harbor, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt ordered all Japanese Americans to move to what were called internment camps. So there were 10 camps in different places across the United States. None of the people that were moved were charged with any crime, and they weren't accused of even being involved with Pearl Harbor. Most of them were U.S. citizens or legal residents in the country. At the time, first-generation Japanese immigrants weren't allowed to become citizens, but they could still be here legally. And the government was afraid that because of their ties to Japan, these Americans might become spies for the Japanese or carry out attacks against the U.S. And so they thought putting these families into internment camps would make the U.S. safer. And you can see from these pictures a couple of those families. All right, so this next slide is just thinking about our rights. Remember, we talked about our rights and our responsibilities. And think about what rights were taken away from the Japanese as they were ordered to move to one of those camps. Again, you don't need to type here, but I want you to think about those things. So there was a camp in Utah, and that camp was called Topaz, and it was located near Delta, Utah. And if you look at the map, you can see where it is. We kind of are up here, and so it was a little distance from us. But at the time, while it was in place, it was the 5th largest city in Utah while it was being used. And it housed more than 11,000 people of Japanese descent between 1942 and 1945. Most of those people came from California. A few came from Washington and Oregon, and some came from Hawaii. So as you can guess, the Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that means basically you can't take away someone's freedom unless they've been proven guilty of a crime. And none of these people had been proven guilty of a crime. And yet we were at war with the country that they were from. So you need to think, do you think that the U.S. government violated their rights by putting them in internment camps? Think about how you would feel about that. So there's another video here. Now this video comes from a video camera that was smuggled into a Japanese internment camp in Topaz. And the question you're being asked is, what was the climate like? And not climate like weather climate, but what did it feel like in the camp? And what problems were created there? How did the Japanese Americans try to make the best of things? And what do you think about Dave Tatsuno's brother, who was a U.S. soldier, who was in the military, had to go past these U.S. guards in order to visit his family? And this slide, it talks about Mrs. Yamauchi Hori's third grade class kept a daily diary from March to August 1943. The students discussed what they would write each day and took turns making drawings for each page. Mrs. Hori did the handwriting. And so you're going to look at a couple of links. If you click on the highlighted links under Diary 1, the Buddhist Temple Diary entry link, and 4th of July Diary entry link, and think about, why do you think that not only did they celebrate their Buddhist holidays, but they also celebrated holidays like the 4th of July? So think about those questions. And then you're going to come and read the account of the person on the right. So I want you to read this account. There are some questions here. And why do you think, after you have read it, why do you think it was so important to those students, those children that went to school? Why do you think they worked so hard to get there, even through this storm that they had to go through? So think about those things. Also, look at this, the first sentence, where this Uchido Yoshiko talks about applying to work in the Topaz Elementary School. And he said, I applied to work in the Topaz Elementary School system and earned a salary of $19 a month for the 40-hour week. So in 1 month, he worked 40 hours each week. He earned only $19. Continue to read that and think about whether you would adapt as well as those children did to the situation that they are in. This next photo and page talks about the Nisei soldiers. So Nisei soldiers were soldiers that their parents were born in Japan, they were born in the U.S., and they actually joined the military to fight against Japan and to fight in World War II. So interesting questions here. If your family had been interned by the government, would you want to fight for our country? Think about that. Why would you want to, or why not? And then there's a funeral service down at the bottom where they're holding the wreaths. And how would you feel if your child, while you were in an internment camp, had died fighting for the country that was holding you in this camp? Again, this talks a little bit about the security there at Topaz. So look at the pictures, think about the questions. And then as we go to this last page, this is the page that you need to answer. This is what we will be checking to see if you've done the work on this. So this is talking about, again, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So this is a repeat of a slide that we've seen before, that you can't take away someone's freedom unless they've been proven guilty of a crime. So your instructions here, and the question that you need to answer is, do you think the U.S. government violated the rights of Japanese Americans by putting them in internment camps? So we talked about this before. You've looked at this before. This time I want you to answer it and put your work in. And that is the end of today. It's a longer unit, but very interesting and in a really important period of time in U.S. history, and important for you to understand and know about.